A newborn is smiling at you right now. Not because you said something, not because you made a face. You're not even in the room. They're completely asleep, and the corners of their mouth are pulling up into something that looks unmistakably like joy. Most parents see it and reach for their phone. They caption it, "dreaming of me," and they mean it, because what else could it be? But what if I told you that smile has nothing to do with dreaming? What if the science behind it doesn't just rewrite what you think your baby is doing? It raises a question about consciousness itself that researchers still can't answer. Because here's what's actually happening inside that sleeping brain. And once you understand it, you'll never look at a sleeping newborn the same way again. Let's start with the assumption everyone makes. Babies smile in their sleep because they're having good dreams, sweet ones, warm milk and familiar voices and the feeling of being held. It's a beautiful idea. There's just one problem with it. It's almost certainly wrong. And the reason why takes us somewhere far stranger. Developmental neurologists have a name for what you're watching when a newborn smiles in their sleep. They call it endogenous smiling, spontaneous smiling. And the first thing you need to understand about it is when it happens. It doesn't occur during deep, quiet sleep. It occurs almost exclusively during active sleep, what in adults we'd call REM, the phase where the brain is most electrically alive. Now here's where it gets interesting. Newborns spend roughly half their total sleep time in this active state. Adults average around 20%. That's not a small difference. That's a fundamentally different relationship with sleep. And for decades, scientists assumed this was just developmental. Babies sleep differently because they're small and new, and everything about them is different. But a growing body of research suggests something more deliberate is happening. That REM sleep in a newborn isn't rest, it's construction. The brain of a newborn at birth is, by the standards of mammalian biology, radically unfinished. We are the least complete mammal delivered into the world. A foal can walk within hours. A human infant can barely regulate its own temperature. And what neuroscientists have found is that the brain uses those long, dense stretches of active sleep to do something that can't happen any other way: to wire itself, to rehearse circuits it hasn't used yet, to fire pathways before any experience has traveled through them. And the smile? The smile is one of those circuits going live for the first time. Think about what a social smile actually requires. It's not just a muscle movement. It involves the motor cortex, yes, but it also requires emotional processing, social recognition, a theory of what the other person's face means. It's one of the most complex outputs the human brain produces. And your newborn, at 2 days old, at 5 days old, doesn't have those systems online yet. So the brain does what any sophisticated system does before a critical feature goes live. It tests it in isolation. Dr. Peter Wolf at Harvard was among the first researchers to document this systematically. What he observed, watching sleeping neonates in the early 1960s, was that these smiles weren't random. They occurred in clusters, during specific phases of sleep, in a pattern that suggested coordination, not chaos. The face wasn't just twitching, something was organizing it. Later researchers, using the imaging tools Wolf never had access to, built on what he found. And the picture that's emerged is this. The brain, in those first weeks, is running its own diagnostics, firing motor sequences through pathways that will later carry emotional information, testing them for integrity, for response time, for coordination between hemispheres. The smile is the output of a circuit check. The emotion comes later. The hardware comes first. Now, pause on that for a second, because what it implies is genuinely strange. It means your baby is smiling before they're capable of feeling the thing the smile is supposed to express. The expression exists before the inner state it represents. If you study philosophy of mind, you know why that matters. One of the oldest debates in consciousness research is whether our inner experiences cause our expressions, or whether the relationship runs the other direction, whether the expression itself is part of how the experience gets generated. The sleeping newborn smile sits right at the center of that argument, and it doesn't resolve it, it deepens it. But here's where the science moves from fascinating to something closer to important. Because those early spontaneous smiles turn out to not be random noise. They're predictive. A study published in Infant Behavior and Development tracked the frequency and quality of spontaneous sleep smiles in the first weeks of life. Then they followed those same infants forward. What they found was a correlation. Children who showed more frequent and more symmetrical early sleep smiling showed greater social responsiveness later. Higher scores on the metrics developmental psychologists use to measure how fluidly a child reads and responds to the emotional world around them. Which means the diagnostic test isn't just maintenance, it's calibration. The brain is not only checking whether the circuits work, it's shaping how well they'll eventually function. Every sleep smile in those first weeks is the social brain rehearsing for a performance it won't give for another 6 weeks. You are watching the previews for a person. But if you thought that was the deepest layer of this, there's one more. And this is the part that pediatric neurologists pay close attention to, the part that almost never makes it out of clinical literature. The symmetry of those early smiles matters, because when something is wrong, not dramatically, not visibly, when a neural pathway isn't developing the way it should, one of the first places it shows up is in asymmetry, a smile that pulls harder on one side than the other, a smile that's delayed on one half of the face. Certain metabolic conditions, certain early neurological differences, certain pressures and irregularities that leave no visible mark anywhere on a sleeping infant's body. They show up first in the face, in the sleep smile. Before any behavioral test can be run, before any developmental milestone can be missed, before there's anything else to see. Which is why neonatal neurologists look at it. Which is why, if you're a parent and something about the way your infant's face moves in sleep feels asymmetric or absent, not quirky, not babies are weird, but genuinely one-sided or missing, that is worth mentioning. Not because something is certainly wrong, but because the brain's plasticity in the first 2 years is never that high again. And early attention to something small can change what that something becomes. Now here's the part that stays with me, because humans aren't the only ones who do this. Neonatal sleep smiling has been documented in chimpanzees, in other great apes. The behavior is old. It predates us. But the window, the length of time that newborns produce these endogenous smiles before the social smile comes online, is uniquely extended in humans. We have a longer runway, more time between the first circuit test and the first genuine emotional expression. And that extended window is almost certainly connected to how unfinished we arrive. We need more rehearsal time because we have more to build. 15,000 years of evolution didn't make human infants the most socially complex creatures on Earth by accident. It built a brain that practices being human before it's awake enough to know what human means. And it starts in sleep. In the dark, in a face you're watching from across a quiet room. So the next time you see it, that small, unprompted curve at the corners of a sleeping baby's mouth, you're not watching a dream. You're watching construction. You're watching a brain run the first test of something it will use for the rest of its life. You're watching the previews before consciousness comes online. And the fact that it looks like joy, before joy is even possible, might be the most human thing about us. If this changed how you see the moments you thought you already understood, subscribe. Because the next video goes somewhere darker. Why babies lock their eyes on empty corners at 3 a.m., and what the science actually suggests they might be responding to. It's stranger than anything you've heard before.